This is a Sicha from Likutei Sichos, Chelek Zayin, Parshas Vayikra, Sicha Gimel, and the topic of the Sicha is that in this week's Parsha, we learned the pasuk that speaks about an oila of an oif, of a bird, and it says that Vayikrive HaKohen El HaMizbeach, the Kohen should bring it to the Mizbeach, Malach Esreisha and do Malika, V'hiktir HaMizbecha, and the Kohen should burn it on the Mizbeach, but before that, V'nimtza Damai Al Kir HaMizbeach, V'nimtza Damai, should squeeze the blood on the wall of the Mizbeach. And we learned the teaching of Rashi on the words V'nimtza Damai, where Rashi explains what these words mean. And there are 4 parts in the Sicha. The Rebbe, number 1, asks 6 questions on Rashi. Number 2, present the key to answering the questions, which the key is to understand what's really bothering Rashi. And then number 3, based on this, on understanding what's really bothering Rashi, the Rebbe will answer all 6 questions. And number 4, present the Yenishal Torah in Rashi. On the pasuk that teaches about bringing a carbon oila from an oif, from a bird, where it says V'yikrive HaKohen El HaMizbeach, that the Kohen should bring it to the Mizbeach, Umalach Esreisha, and do Malika, V'hiktir HaMizbeach, and he should burn it on the Mizbeach, and before that, V'nimtza Damai Al Kir HaMizbeach, he should squeeze the blood on the wall of the Mizbeach. So Rashi quotes the words V'nimtza Damai, and he explains this is L'shain Mitz Apayim, which is a pasuk in Mishlei, and it speaks about squeezing out a person's anger, which then causes a fight with someone else. And it's also the lashon of Ki Ofes HaMetz, which is a pasuk in Yeshaya, where he's asking Moav to help the Yidden, and he's saying that they should understand the situation of the Yidden, because they too have lost everything. And he says Ki Ofes HaMetz, that they no longer have the sheep and the flock from which they would squeeze out milk. So we see that the Nimtza is a lashon of squeezing out. And then Rashi explains Kovesh Beis HaShchita, he presses the part where he shechted the bird, Al Kir HaMizbeach, onto the wall of the Mizbeach, V'hadam Mismatze V'yerid, and the blood is then squeezed out and runs down the wall of the Mizbeach. Now simply, Rashi is coming to translate the word v'nimtza, which is a word that is not mentioned in the Torah until now, and it's not a regular word in the Torah. And therefore he explains what the word means. It's l'shain mitzapayim, and the lashon of ki ofes hametz. However, we have to understand, and there are 6 questions here. The first question is, what's the connection between the explanation of how the mitzvah was done, that kovesh beis hashchita al kir mizbeach v'adam esmatze v'yered, that comes immediately after this teaching of Rashi, to the translation of the word v'nimtza, that because of this connection, therefore Rashi teaches them in one dibur maschal. What's the connection between these 2 teachings? L'cheira, if Rashi is coming to explain the manner in which the mitzvah is done, and it's not connected to the lashon of v'nimtza, so then he should have taught it in its own and in a separate dibur maschal. From the fact that Rashi teaches both of these teachings in one dibur maschal shows that they're connected. And so the question is, what is that connection? That therefore Rashi teaches them in one dibur maschal. The second question is, why does Rashi need to bring 2 proofs for the meaning of a nimtza, and he doesn't make do with just one of them? The third question is, why does Rashi specifically choose these 2 psukim, where we find the word that's similar to v'nimtza? We find this lashon in other places as well. The fourth question is, adding to the third question about why Rashi chooses these 2 psukim, so moreover, in Mishlei, from where Rashi brings the lashon mitzapayim, so over there Rashi explains that the lashon of mitz in the pasuk of mitzapayim is k'moi vayimetz tal, which is found earlier in Shoftim. If so, he should have brought us proof from the pasuk of vayimetz tal, and for 2 reasons. Number 1, it's before Mishlei, and number 2, because it's actually the source for understanding the word in Mishlei. The fifth question is, in the 2 proofs themselves, so Rashi first brings the proof from mitzapayim, which is in Mishlei, and not the pasuk of ki ofes hametz, which is earlier in Yeshaya. And the 6th question is, in the pasuk in Mishlei, it says earlier, in that pasuk itself, before the words mitzapayim, it says twice the lashon of mitz. It says mitz chalav yetzi chema, umitz af yetzi dam, and only afterwards it says umitzapayim yetzi riv. And Rashi specifically brings the 3rd time that it says mitz. Why is this? So now we're going to present the key to answering all of these questions. So the explanation of all of this is as follows. Rashi over here is not just coming to translate the word v'nimtza. That's part of what he's doing, but it's not the only thing that he's doing. But rather he's also coming to answer a question that there is in the pasuk. So besides for the question about the translation of the word v'nimtza, there's also a question in Havana. There's a question in the understanding of the pasuk over here that's tied into the word and tied into the translation of the word v'nimtza. And the question is, v'nimtza is a lashon nifal. So there's something called lashon poel, which means to do something, and then there's lashon nifal, which means something was done. So for example, to throw something would be lashon poel, and to say that something was thrown is lashon nifal. So v'nimtza means something that was done, lashon nifal, which means that it's as if it happens on its own. Meaning, in other words, over here, what it would mean is that the person does a number of things, and as a result of one of those things which are done for whatever purpose it's done, so also it causes something else, which is v'nimtza damai, meaning that the blood becomes squeezed out on its own onto the kir mizbech through one of the other things that the person does, either the Vayikra mizbecha or through the malika. And if so, it's not understood. There's a difficulty, which is, we know from earlier that by a carbon oila from a behema, over here we're talking about a carbon oila of an oif, so we know that by a carbon oila of a behema, there are the avodas of shchita, and then the zrika of the blood on the mizbeach, and then the aktara. So there's shechting the animal, there's throwing the blood on the mizbeach, and then there's burning it on the mizbeach. Therefore the question is, we also find the avodas of shchita and aktara by an oila from a bird. Just that instead of shchita, by a bird there's malika. And then you have the aktara afterwards. However, what about the avodah in between? The avodah of zrika. We don't find by an oil of a bird an avodah that's similar to the avodah of zrika of the blood on the mizbeach. And so the question is, where is that avodah by a carbon oil of a bird? According to this understanding, that there are two questions on the word v'nimtza. Number one, what is the translation of the word? And number two, that it's written in a lashon nifal, which creates a question about where is the avodah that's similar to zrika by the carbon oil of a bird. We can now answer our first question. So therefore, because of these two questions about the word v'nimtza, so after Rashi brings the proofs about the lashon of v'nimtza, he explains that the nifal of v'nimtza comes through an avodah, a pu'ula of a person, and a special pu'ula. The pula of koivish, that the person presses the base hashchita al ker mizbeach v'adam esmatza v'yerid, which is similar to the avodah of zrika of the blood on the mizbeach. And as we're going to see, we're going to go on to explain how all the other questions are also answered, and then we're going to wrap up and complete the answering of this first question, because we still have to complete the answer to the question. But generally speaking, the point of the answer is the Rashi is addressing two things about the word v'nimtza itself. Number one, what is the translation? And number two, that it's in a lashon nifal. And Rashi is telling us the translation of the word v'nimtza, and also that even though it's written in a lashon nifal, it comes through a pu'ula. And as we'll see how that's connected to the proofs that Rashi brings. Now we're going to move on to answering questions number 2, 3, 5, and 6. So question number 2 is, why do we need two proofs? Question number 3 is, why these two proofs and not others? Question 5 was that ki office hametz should be the first proof because it appears first in Yeshaya, which comes before Mishlei. And question 6 was, this is the third time it says mitz in that pasuk of Mishlei. So why does Rashi bring the third time that it appears and not the first time? So according to this that we explained, it's understood why Rashi chooses specifically these two proofs, because these two proofs emphasize that the meaning of a nimtza is connected with the pula of a person, which is the pula of kvisha, pressing. So because over here Rashi is not just coming to tell us the translation of the word v'nimtza, but also how it's a pu'ula, so he uses these two proofs, because these two proofs don't just tell us the translation of the word v'nimtza, but they also show us how v'nimtza is connected to a pu'ula, to an action, and it's not a nifl. So we're going to begin by explaining why Rashi doesn't bring the first two times that the word mitz appears in the pasuk in Mishlei. From the beginning of the pasuk in Mishlei, where it says mitz chalav yetzi chema, that from milk comes butter, umitz af yetzi dam, and from a person's nose, blood comes out. So from there's no proof to our discussion that v'nimtza is in a way of koivish beis hashchita, because both chema from chalav and dam from af don't come through a pu'ula of kvisha, of pressing, of squeezing, but rather through hitting or striking. And as we'll see later why it's important that it should be specifically kvisha. Moreover, not only don't they come through the pula of kvisha, of squeezing or pressing, but sometimes they come by themselves. Chema swims above the chalav on its own, and sometimes dam comes from itself, from the af, as we see. And therefore, Rashi specifically brings the end of the pasuk of mitzapayim yetzi riv, that through squeezing out, through pressing out a person's anger, then it creates a fight with another person. Because there the mitz is in the same manner as koivish beis hashchita. Through squeezing and bringing out the anger, then yetzi riv, then it creates a fight. But if a person doesn't bring out their anger, then it won't lead to a fight with another person. However, this proof alone is also not enough. So now we're answering why Rashi needs two proofs. Since the mitz by apayim is with a pula that's not a physical action. It's not a physical thing, which means that it's not like kevish beis hashchita, which is a physical action. And therefore Rashi also brings the pasuk of ki ofei sametz. There in the pasuk of ki ofei sametz, it means the chalav and the chema, the milk and the butter, which are squeezed from the tzainu bakar. Rashi says clearly that it's talking about that it comes through squeezing, through pressing. Now, this is number one, in action. And number two, the milk doesn't come through hitting, but rather through actual squeezing, just like the kevesh beis hashchita. So that's why Rashi brings this second proof. Now, why does Rashi bring this proof second? Why doesn't he bring it first, that appears first, or maybe just bring this proof? So the explanation for that is that, however, this proof from ki ofei sametz alone is also not enough. Because there we can learn that the mates isn't emphasizing the action of squeezing itself, but rather it's a description of the wealth of the tzainu bakar, which results from squeezing the chalav and chema from them. So the emphasis in the pasuk over there is not that it's done through squeezing, but rather the emphasis is about the wealth of the tzainu bakar. And it mentions what's their wealth? That chalav and chema are squeezed from them. As Rashi explains over there, that he was telling Moav to be kind to the Yidden because they too lost their wealth. And he brings it out by saying, Ki ofei sametz. And Rashi explains, Ha-mates shalcha, your mates, ashrecha uchvoidcha. It's referring to your wealth and your honor. Shahayalacha, that you had, al-yedei tzeincha uvkarcha, that you had through your sheep and your flock, shat meitzatz mehem chalav v'chema, that you squeezed chalav and chema from them. So therefore it's not talking about the act of squeezing, it's just saying that it comes through squeezing. And therefore Rashi also has to bring, and actually as the first proof, the proof from mitzapayim, where over there mitz means the actual action of squeezing. It's actually talking about mitzapayim, squeezing out anger. It's just that we need to show that it could also be referring to a physical squeezing, a physical pressing, and therefore he brings the pasuk from Yeshaya. So this is the explanation for why Rashi brings both proofs, and in the order that he brings them. Both psukim bring out that we're talking about kvisha. The advantage of the pasuk in Mishlei is that it's talking about the pu'ula of kvisha, whereas the pasuk in Yeshaya is really talking about the nifl. And the advantage of the pasuk in Yeshaya is that it's talking about a physical kvisha, whereas the pasuk in Mishlei is talking about a spiritual kvisha. So the main thing is to bring out that it's talking about an action of kvisha, which we have in Mishlei. And Yeshaya just supports that it could also be referring to a physical kvisha. Now we're going to move on to answering question number 4. So moving on to the reason that Rashi doesn't bring the proof from Shoftim, from Vayimetz Tal min Agiza, which is a physical action. The reason is because in the same pasuk, before the words Vayimetz Tal, it says Vayazar es Agiza. The words Vayazar es Agiza mean that he squeezed the Giza, he squeezed the fleece of wool. As Rashi says over there, Loshin Machpesh, like over here, Kovish. So therefore, since there was already kvisha, so it's understood that Vayimetz Tal, which was afterwards, doesn't refer to the pula of kvisha of and with the giza, the fleece of wool itself. Rather refers to the coming out of the dew from the giza, as the pasuk concludes, Vayimetz Tal, meaning that the dew came out, mina giza, from the fleece of wool, meloi hasefel mayim, a full pail of water. So over there, the word Vayimetz refers to the water coming out of the fleece of wool, not the act of squeezing and pressing the wool. And therefore, this is not a precise example to our pasuk, where the V'nimtza Dame comes to emphasize the pula of Kovesh Beis Hashchita. We don't have the Kovesh over there. The Kovesh is already said at the beginning of the pasuk, and the word Vayazar Sagiza. So from there, we can't learn at all that we're talking about the pula of Kvisha over here. Now we're going to move on to answering a side question, and that is, if Vayimetz Tal in Shoftim doesn't mean the act of Kvisha, so how does Rashi bring it as a proof and as a source for understanding the words Mitzchalov, Mitzaf, and Mitzapayim in Mishlei? So we explained because it doesn't refer to the pula of Kvisha, we can't bring it as a proof for our pasuk. But we could bring it as a proof for the pasuk in Mishlei, because our pasuk is talking about the pula of Kvisha, which you don't have in Vayimetz Tal, but not so in Mishlei, where Rashi comes to explain not that it's referring to the pula of kvisha, but rather the tzad shava of the three things the pasuk says. Rashi is bringing Vayimetz Tal to understand what it means mitzchalov, umitzaf, and umitzapayim, all three. What is the tzad shava that all of them share? And this is not going to be in the type of pu'ula, in the chalav, af, and apayim, because as we explained, it's actually a different pula by each of them. but rather it's in the result of the pula. The pula which takes out the mitz. The tzad hashava is not in the pula. The pula by each of them is different. The way chema comes from cholav, the way dam comes from an af, and the way a fight comes from anger, it's all different. So what do they have in common? It's in the result of the pula, which is the mitz. Each of them has something that comes out from something else. And for this, the proof from Shayiftim is a good proof, since the Vayimitz refers to tal coming out of the Giza. So too, all 3 times that it says mitz, it's referring to these things coming out of something else, which is exactly what it means also in Shayiftim. Now, based on this, we could return to our first question about why Rashi teaches 2 things in the same Dibur Maschel, because according to this, it's also understood why Rashi explains Koivish Beis HaShchita in the same Dibur Maschel and in continuation to the proofs, since it's connected to his teaching. Because what is his teaching? He's also coming over here to explain that the V'nimtza is through Kvisha. So he's telling us what V'nimtza is, and that it's the pool of Kvisha, because both of those things are needed for us understanding this V'nimtza, understanding how it replaces Zrika. So we have to understand what the word means and how it's a replacement of Zrika. And so that's exactly what Rashi is explaining to us over here. He's telling us the meaning of the word, and that it's through the pool of Kvisha, which is brought out in the proofs that Rashi brings. Now we're going to move on to asking a question on the very basis and premise of this Rashi, and it's connected to our first question. So, however, it remains difficult. The difficulty is, why is it relevant to emphasize that the Mitzvah Adam is specifically through Koivish Beis HaShchita? Why that action specifically? Which therefore, as we explained, Rashi has to bring specifically these 2 psukim as his proofs. Why does it have to be emphasized that the Mitzvah Adam is specifically through Koivish, the act of Kvisha, and not through some other pula? The point is that it has to be a pula. But why specifically the pula of Koivish? It could be a different pula. So we can answer this according to what we explained. We already explained the general idea, and if we look at the details, we'll see how it answers this question as well. So since Rashi learns that V'nimtza is in place of and similar to the Zrika, the Hazah, of the blood on the Mizbeach, so it makes sense that the pu'ulas are similar. So it's not just that there needs to be a pu'ula, but also that the pu'ulas themselves should be similar. And that's specifically when it's done through kvisha. Why? Blood which comes out through striking, like for example by mitzaf yetzidam, it's not in a manner that the blood is constantly coming out through an ongoing pu'ula. The striking causes the start of the blood coming out, which then comes out by itself for a while. Not so by liquids that come through kvisha, like for example by milking a cow, where the continuous coming out of the liquid is a result of the ongoing pula of kvisha. And therefore, since the avodah v'nimtza damei is instead of zrika hazah, which comes entirely through the pula of the kayin is doing the whole pula from beginning to end, so therefore Rashi learns that this is also the way it is done by v'nimtza damei, that it's through an action which is an ongoing action, which we find by koivish beis hashchita, specifically by the action of kvisha, and not some other action. And so this is the reason why Rashi says that the pula is specifically kvisha, because not just that there has to be a pula over here, it has to be a pula that's similar to the zrika of the dam. And just like the zrika from beginning to end is an ongoing pula of the kayin, so too we're going to say that the v'nimtza damei is through an ongoing pula, which we only find by the pula of kvisha. From Yenishal Torah, which is in this teaching of Rashi, it's known that the Ramban says regarding the Avedis, which are done with a carbon, which a carbon is machaper for a person, that a person must think, ki chata lelekov, that they sinned against Hashem, begufay v'nafshe, with their body and with their nefesh, v'roi leishi yishafich damei v'yisarif gufay, lulo chesed abeirish lokach mimenu t'mora, if not for the kindness of Hashem, that he took the carbon in exchange. So we see from here that it's a nafshiyisdika thing. And so this is the meaning of why we are makriv, the chaylev and dam of the carbon, the fats and the blood on the mizbeach. And avodas ha'adam, what this represents, it's the tainug, which is the chaylev, the fats, and the koch, the passion, which is the dam, which one has to be makriv, meaning one has to dedicate to Hashem. Therefore, at the conclusion of the first type of karbonis, which is taught in the Torah, which is the carbon oila, which also a carbon oila is machaper on a person's averis, on a mitzvah saseh, and also on a lav anitik laseh. So Rashi teaches that by v'nimtza damei, which is the zrika of the blood, which is the ikar kapara, it's the main thing of the kapara, that the inyan of kapara of a carbon is accomplished by the inyan of mitz, of kvisha, which represents the eskafia and bittul of one's mitzias, like squeezing, pressing. And then there is adamas matzav yerid, that the blood pours down the wall of the mizbeach, meaning that the koch in physical pleasures is squeezed out and leaves the person. And therefore Rashi brings the Loshen Mitzapayim. This is because in the inyan of Mitzapayim Yetziriv is expressed in a remez the general teichen of a chet and the manner of tshuva and kapara for a chet. So in this pasuk of Loshen Mitzapayim, we're going to see how it expresses the general teichen of what a chet is, as well as the manner of tshuva and kapara for a chet. So the explanation for how we see this in the pasuk of Mitzapayim, so Razal say regarding kas, anger, that kol hakayis ki ilu oved avodah zara. Anyone who gets angry, it's as if they're doing avodah zara. As the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, that at the time one is angry, so nistalka mimenu amuna. The person in that moment is not believing in Hashem, because if one believed that it's coming from Hashem, then they wouldn't be angry. Meaning, what this is saying is that the inyan of anger, of kas, expresses being cut off from Hashem, ki ilu oved avodah zara. And this is really the nekuda of all averos, as the Alter Rebbe also explains in Tanya, that this is so since through every avera one becomes at the time cut off from Hashem, similar to how this is through the chet of avodah zara. So kas captures this general inyan of chet, of being cut off from Hashem. And this is the deeper explanation of the end of the pasuk, where it says Mitzapayim, it concludes Yotzi Riv. It's telling us over here the teichen of a chet. Through an avera there becomes a riv with Hashem. There becomes a separation from Hashem. It's just that since by anger it's emphasized and more pronounced, unlike by other averis, as we see that it only says Ki'ilu Oved Avodah Zara by certain averis, even though it's true by all averis, so therefore it's written by Mitzapayim because it's emphasized over there. So that's how we see the Teichen of Chet expressed in Mitzapayim, Yotzi Riv. It brings about being cut off from Hashem. How do we see the idea of Tshuva and Kapara? So when a Yid brings a carbon and does Tshuva for an avera, then too it's Mitzapayim Yotzi Riv. Over there you have this mitz, this pressing, like we said, the skafyon bittel. It's just that then it's in a manner of kovish kasei, and also margaz yetzutev al yitzahara. It's not against Hashem, but it's against the being cut off from Hashem. And in general, this is also by the tshuva for every avera, where a person is kovish and crushes the yitzahara, which brought the person to go against Hashem, to go against the Ratzon HaElyon, and become cut off from Elikus. And through this, the tshuva, this is also Yetziriv, but here it's a Yetziriv with the Yetzahara. And so we see in how this pasuk of Mitzapayim Yetziriv, it brings out both what is the teichen of a chet, as well as what is the tshuva, what's the manner of the tshuva. And this is why it says Mitzapayim in the plural, because there's the kas which brings to a riv with Hashem Rachman al-Tzlan, and then there's the kibush kas, to separate oneself from an iser, when doing tshuva and bringing a carbon, which brings the riv with the Yetzahara. So we have over here both the teichen of chet, which is mitzapayim, when you have the idea of apayim, of anger, which really, like we said, represents all of veris. It brings about Yotzi Riv, Rachman al-Tzlan with Hashem. And then we have the manner of tshuva. How is tshuva done? Mitzapayim, by being kovish the kas, by crushing and breaking the Yetzahara, through a skafyu and bittul, and then it's Yotzi Riv with the Yetzahara. Now we're going to move on to explain the second pasuk which Rashi brings, the pasuk of Ki Ofes Ametz. So however, after everything that we just explained, there could be a question, which is, since a Yid mitzad atzmai is not shaykh to an avera, like the saying of the Alter Rebbe, that a Yid nitter vil, or nitter ken sein obgerissen von Elikus, and this that a Yid stumbles in an avera is an inyan of an alila. It's brought upon a person from above, from Lamaila, so to speak, and therefore we say, Bal yidach mimenu nidach, that ultimately every Yid will do tshuva. So the question is, so why did there need to be the Yerida and Hester that comes through the chet? What's the point of all of it? So in response to this, Rashi continues, Ki Ofes Ametz, which refers to the chalav, which is squeezed from the tzaynu bakar, meaning to say that what comes out from the schita and kvisha after a person does tshuva is similar to the inyan of chalav, which is something special that you don't have beforehand. What's the inyan of chalav? By chalav there's a kasaka daitach, there's a thought of teres emes that it should be aser. Either because, where does the milk come from? From blood, dam, nekar, v'nasa, chalav within the person, or because it's Eiver Menachai. It's just that the Torah is mechadish, that it's mutter. And it's not just that it's mutter, but it's to the extent that it's an inyan with which we praise Eretz Yisrael, that it's a Eretz Zavas Chalav V'Dvash. So there's a kasaka daitach in Teras Emes that it should be aser, and Torah is mechadish that not only it's mutter, but it's also something to praise Eretz Yisrael with. And this represents the inyan of Ishapcha, something which according to Torah should have been aser, that the Torah makes mutter and even praises. And similarly in Ruchnius, the purpose of the mitzvah payim yetzi riv, that first the person did an avera, and it made a riv with Hashem, and then the person was kovish kasei, and made a riv with the yetzer hara, is for the union of his skafi and his hapcha, which is to transform the ra to toiv. As the Tanya explains the pasuk of Kol Pal Hashem L'Ma'aneu V'Gam Rasha L'Yom Ra, that everything that Hashem made was for her sake, and even a Rasha L'Yom Ra. What's the meaning of V'Gam Rasha L'Yom Ra? That perish, the meaning is Sheyashav Mirishay, that he should return from his rishus, V'Yasa Rasha Lo Yom V'Er L'Maylo. V'Gam Rasha, that what should the Rasha do? L'Yom, he should turn into Yom and Er L'Maylo Ra, his rishus. And this avodah accomplishes, like we say about karbonis, a reach nichoyach laHashem, a nachas ruach v'Hashem, that from dvarim charifim, oy mechumatzim, from sharp or sour foods, rak shehem utbalim u'mesukanim hetiv, it's just that they are prepared well, they're spiced well, achanasu ma'adanim, they're made into delicacies, lahoshav hanefesh, which represents the avodah of iskaf yiras hapcha, taking something which is ra, charifim u'mesukim, and turning it into something good, ma'adanim lahoshav hanefesh, and all of this brings about istalik yikara dekutra brichu bekulu almin.